Welcome back to another explainer. Today we're diving into a story that honestly sounds like it was ripped right out of a gothic horror novel. But I promise you, every bit of this is entirely true. You know, when we think of Benjamin Franklin, our minds immediately go to the kite, the key, the quintessential Enlightenment thinker, and of course, a legendary founding father. We know his final resting place is a highly venerated site in the United States. But in 1997, a chilling, truly macabre discovery was made across the Atlantic, one directly linked to his former residence in London. It's a forensic mystery that forces us to look at the birth of modern science through a much darker lens.
1,200. That is the staggering number of bone fragments, both human and animal, that were discovered buried in a secret, dirt-filled pit beneath a London basement floor back in 1997. Now keep in mind, this wasn't an ancient burial ground or some forgotten graveyard. No, this was a deliberate, concealed pit hidden away in a residential townhouse.
So when a discovery like that is made in a basement, the human mind naturally tends to jump to the absolute worst possible conclusion. In fact, this dramatic question, was a founding father secretly a serial killer, was literally the very first thought that crossed the minds of the modern police investigators called to the scene. You really have to imagine the sheer shock of unearthing a mass grave in a historic property. It set the stage for a true crime forensic mystery that nobody saw coming.
Let's set the scene a bit. The address is 36 Craven Street, right in the heart of London. This elegant Georgian townhouse actually holds a special place in history because it's Benjamin Franklin's only surviving residence anywhere in the world. He lived there for nearly 2 decades as a colonial ambassador. Well, in the late 90s, conservationists and builders were carefully excavating the basement to restore the property and turn it into a museum. Suddenly, they hit a pit. It was just 1 meter wide and 1 meter deep, but it was absolutely packed with the skeletal remains of at least 15 people. And tragically, several of those skeletons belonged to infants.
The builders obviously halted their work immediately and called the authorities. Retired Detective Inspector Jim O'Connell from New Scotland Yard arrived on the scene. As documented by Icon Films, O'Connell admitted that in his 30 years in the police service, this was the very first time he had ever been called to a private address where bones had been actively concealed inside the property. Fearing they had a modern, prolific serial killer on their hands, O'Connell immediately called the local coroner to get some expert assistance.
And this is exactly where the science steps in to correct that initial panic. Coroner Paul Knapman, working alongside University College London bioarchaeologist Professor Simon Hewson, began meticulously analyzing and dating the fragments. They pretty quickly determined this was not the work of a modern killer at all. The bones dated back over 2 centuries, specifically to the mid-1700s. Now, the implications of this timeline were massive, because the mid-1700s was precisely the time when Benjamin Franklin lived in that very house. The mystery just kept deepening. Okay, let's dive into the bizarre forensic clues found in the pit, because this is where the serial killer theory completely falls apart. The experts didn't just find standard skeletal remains. They found human skulls that had been meticulously sawn and drilled. They found highly precise dissection marks on both the adult and infant bones. But perhaps most bizarrely, mixed right in with the human remains were the bones of dogs, stained with a bright red pigment called vermilion. Oh, and marine turtle bones containing actual free-flowing droplets of liquid mercury. This pointed far away from a cold-blooded murder and pointed directly towards scientific anatomical study.
Just look at the classic, straight surgical cuts on these actual skull fragments pulled right from the Craven Street pit. It clearly demonstrates how the skulls were methodically sectioned to remove the top of the brain case. This isn't the chaotic work of a murderer frantically trying to hide a body. This is the deliberate, precise work of a surgeon practicing their craft and attempting to understand the mechanics of the human body.
So, who was doing this? That points us toward the real culprit behind the bones. Meet William Hewson. He was a brilliant young doctor, a pioneer anatomist, and actually Benjamin Franklin's close friend. In fact, he married Polly Stevenson, the daughter of the landlady at 36 Craven Street. Hewson was a total rising star in the medical field, best known for his groundbreaking work isolating the key protein in blood clotting, which we now know as fibrinogen. In 1772, with the backing of his friend Benjamin Franklin, William Hewson opened his very own anatomy school right there at 36 Craven Street. He ran this highly successful, albeit highly secretive school from the property, experimenting on animals and dissecting human cadavers to teach eager young medical students. Remember those turtle bones with the mercury? That was Hewson injecting liquid mercury into turtles to map their lymphatic systems, a massive discovery that actually earned him the prestigious Copley Medal. But this raises a massive ethical dilemma of the era. Where in the world was William Hewson getting all these bodies? In the 1770s, anatomy was in its infancy, and studying it absolutely required human specimens. But the only legal source for corpses was the gallows, which didn't provide nearly enough bodies for a busy school. So early anatomists had to rely on resurrectionists. These were illegal grave robbers who scoured churchyards in the dead of night to snatch freshly buried corpses and sell them to the highest medical bidder. This shady underground trade thrived until the Anatomy Act of 1832 finally regulated the practice.
The physical location of 36 Craven Street was absolutely perfect for this illicit trade. The house was situated very close to the River Thames, which allowed these resurrection men to clandestinely deliver the stolen bodies by boat under the cover of darkness. Once safely inside the basement, Hewson and his students could practice advanced surgical techniques, for example, using a specialized drill called a trephine to remove discs of bone from the skull, a technique perfectly preserved in the artifacts recovered from the pit. Once the dissections were complete, it was way too risky to smuggle the bodies back out, so Hewson simply buried the evidence right beneath the basement floor.
The pursuit of medical knowledge in the 18th century was a highly dangerous game, and it ultimately cost William Hewson his life. In a really tragic twist of irony, while dissecting a decomposing corpse in 1774, Hewson accidentally cut himself. Bacteria from the cadaver entered his bloodstream, and the brilliant young doctor died of septicemia at the age of just 34. Following his death, Benjamin Franklin actually encouraged Hewson's widow and children to relocate to Philadelphia, helping establish a medical dynasty in America.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. Benjamin Franklin almost certainly knew exactly what was happening beneath his floorboards. He was a man of intense scientific curiosity. He understood that to push the boundaries of medicine and save lives in the future, doctors simply had to understand human anatomy. Franklin, like many forward-thinking men of his time, seemingly accepted the grim illegal reality of the body-snatching trade and the basement bone pit as a necessary evil for the advancement of the Enlightenment.
And this brings us to a profound historical contrast that we really need to highlight. To be absolutely clear, Benjamin Franklin's actual remains are not under his Craven Street home. He is buried at the Christ Church Burial Ground in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. However, in 1997, conservationists renovating his former London residence at 36 Craven Street discovered over 1,200 human bone fragments buried in a secret pit beneath the basement floor. It is just such a stark contrast. On one hand, you have Franklin's celebrated public resting place in the U.S., a site so revered that visitors continuously toss pennies onto his grave in tribute. On the other hand, you have the Craven Street pit. Over 1,200 anonymous bone fragments representing the poor, the forgotten, and the stolen, hidden away in a secret London basement to fuel the very science Franklin championed.
This 1997 archaeological discovery, which was extensively documented by teams like Icon Films, forces us modern historians to look at the past with incredibly clear eyes. It requires us to reconcile the gruesome, messy, and deeply unethical realities of the Enlightenment with the polished, celebrated legacy of the Founding Fathers. Progress, it seems, was quite literally built on the bones of the less fortunate, buried completely out of sight in the basement.
Which leaves us with a fascinating and honestly slightly unsettling final thought. If one of the most famous men in American history had 1,200 butchered bones hiding beneath his London garden, what else is out there? How many other dark secrets, how many other macabre histories of the Enlightenment are still lying entirely undisturbed just below the surface of our modern, bustling cities? It really makes you wonder what you're walking over every single day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what's beneath the surface.